This is PowerPoint Lecture 2.2 for Survey of Economics. And in this lecture, we're going to go over the concept of macroeconomic growth. And you see here what we're going to look at. We're going to look at economic growth. Primarily, we look at the capital to labor ratio, and we'll explain why that is. And we'll differentiate between short run and long run economic growth at the macro level. Largely, it's at the micro level as well. But we'll differentiate as we have before. Before I mentioned to you that short run macroeconomic growth, okay, is really movement within the PPC. It's a movement towards potential, whereas long run growth increases your potential output. And we'll look at how that is. For really long-term growth, to some degree, short-term growth as well, but what you really want for long-term growth is expansion in the factors of production. And we talked about the factors of production way back when in microeconomics with land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. Improvements in either the quantity or quality of any of these expands your PPC. When we talk about it, I've mentioned this before, that what we're really looking at here is improvements in either the potential productivity per worker or the actual productivity per worker. And that is going to be largely based on something that we refer to as the capital to labor ratio. And of course, as you have before, and I've not made mention of this, but you see that I spell the word capital, the German spelling with the K. The reason for this, I've mentioned something else similar to this before, has to do with symbolic logic. In economics, from the very get-go of the class, we use the letter C to refer to cost. We can't now go and use the letter C to refer to capital. And so we use the letter K to refer to capital. And of course, what that means is that's productive equipment. That's equipment that's used to produce something else. And so we're going to take a good hard look at the capital to labor ratio and what happens with it and what the problems are with it. Okay. Now, as I've mentioned before, here's our growth in the production possibility curve. The outward shift in this production possibility curve represents an increase in the factors of production. Okay, capital, labor, land, entrepreneurial ability. Particularly the capital to labor ratio, although it's not directly associated here. Okay, it's indirectly associated. When we're moving within the current production possibility, okay, that's short-term growth. If we're at a point, say, right here, and we move outward, that's short-term growth. This increases our potential productivity and is long-term growth. And so if you improve the capital labor ratio, if you give people more capital equipment and make them more productive, you can be producing in here and pushing outward towards your potential. But it's also going to have the effect of pushing the potential outwards. Let's take a closer look at the capital to labor ratio, the amount of capital equipment available for each unit of labor, function of total amount of capital and the labor force, both of which are tracked on the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which I've mentioned before. Now, the first thing we note is that the capital to labor ratio, if left on its own and not messed with in any way, has a natural tendency to deteriorate. Okay, gets smaller. It diminishes over time, is another way of saying that. Now, the reason for this is twofold. First of all, as I've mentioned before, you have capital depreciation. When you have a capital piece of equipment, when you have a piece of capital, capital will depreciate over time, okay? And what I explained before was that when you're dealing with any durable good, capital or not, okay, when you have a good that can be used more than once in its intended function, every time you use it, a certain amount of its value is expended in that use. The example I used was automobiles, but we could use any example, okay? That's one reason. And so when we deal with the capital labor ratio, and you see basically this is how we're going to figure it out. We're going to put the amount of capital over the labor force. And so it's a ratio. Well, as a result of the depreciation, this number is going to get continually smaller. The other reason for the diminution or the deterioration over time are increases in the labor force. People being what they are, they have a tendency to reproduce. And when they reproduce, eventually their children join the labor force when they become age 16 and begin to seek a job. Okay? That means that you have a natural tendency for the labor force to get larger, which means at the same time you're suffering depreciation, which is this number getting smaller, you have increases in population and therefore the labor force, and this number is getting larger. Okay, as a result, the overall ratio will diminish. This is just to amplify what we've previously said regarding depreciation. Okay, reduction in the value of capital over time resulting from its use. Each time a piece of capital equipment is used, blah, 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 a certain amount of its value is transferred into the product. This value is used up. Okay, we talked about this as value added. Okay, one of the things that creates the value of a thing is the value that's added to it. That's going to be partially diminished as a result of depreciation. And this is all stuff I've mentioned before. I'm just amplifying it here. We'll now look at an example of a capital to labor ratio. Okay, so follow along. We start with an amount of dollar value of capital of $10,000 and a labor force of 100 workers. Okay, that means that we have a capital to labor ratio of $100 per worker. Each worker has capital available to them of $100. All right. Following this out, now let's bring in our nemesis, depreciation. Let us suppose that we have 10% depreciation of our capital stock. Okay, so that 10% of the capital is used up as we're using it. Okay. What that means is that after the year, if we suffered the 10% in a year, okay, after the year, our level of capital will go down to $9,000. It will be the $10,000 minus the 10% depreciation. 10% of 10,000 is 1,000, and so we'll drop down to $9,000 worth of capital. With no change whatsoever in the labor force, if the labor force is left alone, our capital to labor ratio has dropped from $100 a worker to $90 a worker. What this does is this reduces potential productivity. That would represent an inward shift of the production possibility curve. Okay? Does it necessarily mean a drop in gross domestic product and actual productivity? No, it does not. The only way it would be an actual drop in gross domestic product and the actual production levels is if we were producing at maximum. Okay, as I've mentioned to you before, ordinarily an economy, a firm, is producing within its production possibility horizon. Okay, meaning that it's underutilizing resources. If we start with $100 per worker, if we are producing within the horizon less than our potential, then we're not using all of that. So a reduction down to $9 per worker does not necessarily mean a reduction in gross domestic product. It does mean a reduction in potential gross domestic product. So the PPC would shift inward, but because we're already underutilizing resources, we still might not be working at maximum capacity. Surely, if we don't change the amount that we're utilizing, we'll end up using more of our capacity. But it does not necessarily mean a reduction in GDP. It does necessarily mean a reduction in potential GDP. And remember the difference between actual production and potential production. We now will bring into this conundrum, this problem, labor force. Okay, each year population grows, new workers enter the workforce. Some workers leave from retirement, they die, whatever. Some come in. So let's look at our example and say, okay, let's say 5 people leave the labor force. They retire, they quit working, they decide they've had enough of it, whatever. Okay, and 10 people enter, giving us a net increase of 5 people. We started with a labor force of 100. If we add 5 people to that, what percentage increase is there in our labor force? A 5% increase. Okay, our new labor force is 105 people. That's a 5% increase on 100 people on our original. Adding this in with what we discussed previously regarding depreciation. Whenever you increase your labor force, does it not then stand for reason that if we increase the labor force, we are going to need investment? By definition, investment is the purchase or investment is the purchase of capital equipment. And what we talked about was you have 2 types of investment. You have gross investment, which includes the replacement of depreciated capital. In this case, in our example, we depreciated $1,000 worth of capital. Okay, so we need at least $1,000 in gross investment just to get back to where we were. Okay, and then we'll need some net investment too. And so we follow this out and put the 2 things together. Previously, we said, okay, we have 10% capital depreciation. That drops our capital level from 10,000 down to 9,000. In addition, we have a 5% increase in the labor force. That brings our workers up to 105. So that now our capital to labor ratio is $85.71 per worker. All right, this is down from $100 per worker. What this means, again, to reiterate, is that this does not necessarily mean reduced production or reduced real gross domestic product. If we are underutilizing resources already, okay, then reducing our potential output does not necessarily mean we're reducing our output. Okay, the only way it would necessarily mean it is if we are producing at our potential. This does, however, necessarily mean that our potential output, our PPC, is shifting inward. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean it. It does stand to reason that if we maintain our actual level of output and reduce the potential output, we're moving closer. In other words, if we're using 60% of resources and we reduce the level of resources, we may now be using 80% of the resources. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily mean that we've reduced production. It does necessarily mean that we've reduced potential production. And you want to think about that a couple times. I've mentioned that now, I've reiterated it, so think about what that means. Okay, and it further underscores the distinction between potential production and actual production. When we measure GDP, what we're really interested in is actual production. When we deal with the capital to labor ratio and investment, we're now looking more at potential production. Okay, treading water. Okay, what we mean by treading water is neither sinking nor swimming. We're talking about just staying even. Okay, and remember that our original capital to labor ratio was $100. Okay, that's where our PPC is. That's our potential productivity. That's an indication of our potential productivity. So that there's no inward shift of the PPC, what do we need given the increase in the labor force? Okay, from the example, if we simply have gross investment, no net investment, we're not going to be pushing the PPC outward at all. Okay, we simply replace the $1,000 in the depreciated capital, bringing our capital ratio up to 10,000. This is not going to be sufficient to prevent an inward shift of the production possibilities curve. Why? Because of the labor force increase. Okay, we now have 105 workers, a 5% increase. And so our actual capital to labor ratio is $10,000. That's our $1,000 gross investment to replace the depreciated capital. But now it's divided among 105 workers instead of 100 workers. So we have 95.24 per worker. So again, we have an inward shift of the PPC. All right, like we had before. Now, one alternative, just kind of as I'm sitting here talking about this, one possible alternative to this, to restore our original, is to eliminate these 5 workers. Okay? Forced retirement is one possibility. A bullet in the back of the head is another possibility. But we won't get there. That's kind of bloody-minded to deliberately reduce your labor force. It actually could work that if 5 people left the labor force, if they stopped looking for work, if, for example, we gave them transfer payments, we said, you know what, we want to maintain our potential PPC at $100 per worker. We just put $1,000 in investment to bring capital level up to 10,000. But you 5 guys have screwed things up because you've entered the labor force. So now, even with our gross investment, we're up to 95.24. We want you 5 to leave the labor force. How we're going to do that is we'll give you government transfer payments. Leave the labor force. You don't have to work. We'll just give you money. And this is a rational decision on the part of an economic actor, because this is a, the Protestant work ethic. Working is for the birds. Okay. The idea of an economic actor is you want to get the greatest benefit for the lowest cost. To get something for nothing is better than actually having to do something to get something. So, and maybe they'd go along with it. That would increase transfer payments. And actually, this does get into what we're going to talk about next after this PowerPoint, which is fiscal policy, the policy of the government. But at any rate, that gross investment, given the increase in the labor force, is not going to be enough to restore us to our original PPC, to restore us to our original potential production based on the capital to labor ratio. We're going to need net investment, okay? When you have an increase in the labor force, gross investment, replacement of the depreciated capital, is not going to be enough. What you're going to need in addition is net investment. So now the question, okay, for our problem, given the depreciation and the labor force growth, how much total investment is necessary to maintain production levels, and how much of this is net investment? It requires probably 6th grade algebra to figure this out. You now have 105 workers. You need each worker to have available to them $100 in capital. And so you are going to need $10,500 worth of capital. $1,000 has depreciated, so your current level is $9,000 as a result of depreciation. That means you're going to need $1,500. And I explain that here, okay? From the example, with capital depreciation, we've dropped the capital level down to 9,000. Labor force increase, okay? Laborers have gone up to 105. Our original capital labor was $100. So we apply some 6th grade algebra, and we say, okay, the level of capital we need divided by 105 has to be $100, okay? And that will keep us even. That will be the tread water point. That will restore us to $100 per worker, okay? So we need 10,500. Hence, we need 1,500. Well, 1,000 of that is simply the replacement of depreciated capital. So in terms of net investment, you need $500, and you need 1,500 in gross investment, which means 1,000 of it is replacement of capital, and 500 is net investment, okay? So any labor force increase is going to require net investment. And again, to segue us more into the discussion of fiscal policy, okay? When we deal with fiscal policy, we'll deal with the idea of government facilitating economic growth, okay? What is true of all developed countries that cultivate GDP growth rates of anywhere from 0 to as high as 5%? Every single one of them, the first thing they do is stabilize population growth, okay? Because the higher your population growth rate, the higher will be the increase in your labor force, okay? The higher the increase in your labor force, from what we've just said, the higher the increase in the labor force, the more net investment you're going to need. All right? And so if you can keep your labor force fairly stable in terms of its growth rate, then you don't need as much net investment, and it's easier to maintain and ultimately expand the level of production. An example of this, back in the late 1970s, the People's Republic of China developed the idea of economic growth. This was the beginning of the Chinese economic transition. Okay, the first order of business, and they began to implement it in the 80s, was to try to stabilize. They have the largest population on the planet. Was to stabilize population growth rates, and they got a lot of flack for this because to do so, they had to institute what were seen as very draconian measures. Okay, one child per family, in some cases forced abortions. Now, as it works out, much more was made of this than actually took place. The implementation of these laws that came out in the 80s in China, the implementation of these really only took place in urban areas. They were never really able to enforce them very well. Okay. But they've stabilized. It used to be 20 years ago, okay, a lot of Americans would adopt Chinese children. Well, the People's Republic of China had an incentive to do this because it got people out of their country, it got people out of their labor force, therefore they needed less net investment. They stopped that. Now, about 7 years ago, they stopped allowing foreign adoption. Okay. Because they've now stabilized their population growth rate. But at any rate, okay, so you need, whenever your labor force grows, it's not going to be sufficient to simply replace the depreciated capital with gross investment. You're also going to need net investment, okay? And you'll note that the net investment you need, we had a 5% labor force increase. Well, from our original level of capital of $10,500, which is the net investment we need, is 5%. So you need net investment to be equivalent to offset the percentage growth in the labor force. Okay, and here we just kind of reiterate this point from our example. Note that for the economy to tread water and maintain current capital level, percentage change in net investment must equal the percentage change in the labor force. We calculated that the change in net investment must be $500. This is 5% from the original capital stock. The change in the labor force was 5%. Okay. Now here we see, I go back to my friendly neighborhood Bureau of Economic Analysis site. And you see here, this is the level of non-residential capital assets. That means what we're excluding here are houses. Remember I said that when it comes to the gross domestic product and the calculation thereof, that IG figure, gross investment, that includes construction, okay? We are excluding from this chart non-residential or residential capital assets. These are non-residential capital assets, meaning buildings built for commercial purposes and all capital equipment used for production. Now notice this, okay? You have an increase in the capital stock, okay, up until the Great Recession of 2008. Then there is a reduction in the capital stock. Why? Because people are not replacing, producers are not replacing depreciated capital, okay? Instead, they're simply trying to make greater use of the capital they already have. Then in the current growth cycle, you see the increase in the capital stock. Okay, this is in billions of dollars. 25,000 billion is 25 trillion. Okay, so you have about a little bit less than, and now it's a little bit more than 25 trillion in non-residential capital assets. When you add residential capital assets, when you count all capital assets, it's in the neighborhood of $60 trillion. Okay, this is non-residential capital assets. We want to look at this for a minute, because here the red line represents gross domestic product growth rates, okay? And you'll notice here, let's stop, and the blue line is going to be the percentage change in the capital to labor ratio. The capital to labor ratio is calculated by taking that previous number that we looked at in the last slide, in that last chart. That's the total amount of capital. Simply divide that by the labor force, and you get your capital to labor ratio. This studies the percent change in the capital to labor ratio. Okay, this, the percent change in gross domestic product. And so you see, we start from the minor recession that takes place in 2001. Okay, then we have expanding gross domestic product growth rates. Okay, when you have a negative growth rate in the gross domestic product, that means the economy is shrinking. That's a recession. We had that earlier in 2001. Okay, so we started out here. Then the growth came up. Here we hit the peak in the growth rate of the gross domestic product. Okay, this was still part of the growth cycle. What this part means, if we look at the business cycle from the previous lecture, if we look at the business cycle, what this means is, if you can remember, a business cycle went like this, and then it flattened out as it got towards the peak. This is the flattening out of the business cycle. It's a little bit, we need to put this together with what we've previously learned of the business cycle. Okay, this is the flattening out of the business cycle. This is not the beginning of a recession. For a recession, the gross domestic product growth rate has to be below zero. That means your economy is shrinking. That's negative productivity. Okay, that doesn't happen till the middle of 2008, and it will continue until 2009. So this is when you walk into a recession. This drops you down to the trough. Then you begin to grow again, okay? And you see that the growth rate drops. And so that's why people are, given this, they're thinking that with this reduction particularly, that we're at the later stages of the business cycle. This certainly looks like flattening out the curve. We don't have the numbers for gross domestic product growth in 2018. The reason being, it generally takes them about a month, but also we have the government shutdown, so the Bureau of Economic Analysis is not gathering the data and collating it and coming up with this. But the presumption is that you're going to actually have more modest growth rates. That's why it comes as a shock to economists that you had 312,000 jobs built. The growth rate is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of up here still. So you may not be as close to the end of the business cycle as some people think. Now we look at the capital to labor ratio, and what do we note? We note that in the aftermath, okay, of the recession of 2001, the capital to labor ratio drops. What does this mean? Well, the labor force is going up, okay, because people are reproducing. More people are entering the labor force all the time. So the labor force is going up, but the level of capital stock is actually dropping, okay? And so you have a drop in the capital to labor ratio, where the capital stock is just staying the same. If you look at the previous slide, the growth in the capital stock leveled out at this point. It wasn't very high, all right? Then you have an increase associated with the growth in the GDP. You'll notice the capital, and remember, this is actual production. This is potential production. And so what does this mean right here? When your actual production is going up and your potential production is going down, okay? What it means is that it's not actually going down, it's just not expanding as much. Okay, so you have an outward movement of the as long as this blue line, this capital to labor ratio, is greater than zero, you have an outward expansion of the PPC, okay? But that outward expansion is certainly slowing down. At the same time, GDP growth rates are going up. At one point, the GDP growth rate in 2004 is greater than the capital to labor ratio growth rate in 2003. What does this mean? This means you're moving closer to your potential production. Okay, this means the actual production is moving closer to the potential production. The potential production stops growing as fast actual production begins to grow to catch up to it. So what you're doing here, we've talked about this all along. We've talked about this since the first presentation, since the first PowerPoint, that ordinarily you have a production possibility curve, a production possibility horizon. That represents your potential productivity. Ordinarily, you are producing within that horizon. You cannot produce outside of that horizon. It is, hypothetically anyways, impossible, okay, because you would be using more resources than you have, so you can't do that. So you're producing within the horizon, okay? You're underutilizing resources. As you move closer and closer to the PPC, you come closer and closer to actual production, or to potential production, okay? Here, the PPC curve is continuing to move outward, but actual production is catching up. You're moving closer to your PPC. Anytime the growth rate in actual production is greater than the growth rate in potential production, such as this point here in 2010, following the Great Recession, where you have actual production greater than the increase in potential production, you're actually growing closer to your PPC, all right? And we want to think about that just for a minute, to take a little breather and rest on that point and think it through, okay? This is actual production. This is potential production. When actual production is greater than the growth, when the growth rate in actual production is greater than the growth rate in potential production, you're moving closer to your potential production. We see that here, we see that here, we see that in 2015, okay? The PPC in 2014 and 15 actually came very close to zero in terms of its expansion, in terms of its outward movement. And so this was a massive movement towards potential production, okay? But then investment picked up principally. In 2015 and 16, you had a greater percentage of investment as part of the gross domestic product. And so the capital to labor ratio started to rise again. At the same time, the growth rate in actual production came down. And so now we're right about here, that actual production and potential production are growing at about the same pace, okay? And again, we're gonna deal with this again when we deal with fiscal policy, and we're gonna look at, in fiscal policy, we're gonna deal with Keynesianism, and we'll briefly talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt in U.S. history class, U.S. History 2, which covers from the end of Reconstruction in 1877 until date. We look at Franklin Delano Roosevelt, okay? Roosevelt's New Deal, okay, and Keynesianism in general, concerns itself with this red curve, moving closer to actual potential production, moving actual production closer to potential production. It doesn't concern itself so much with actual potential production. And the idea is very simple, and we'll deal with it again when we get there, is that it doesn't really make any sense to push your production possibility curve outward if you're not already working at your potential. If you're underutilizing resources, what point is there in gaining more resources? First, utilize the resources you've got. It's the basic idea behind it, and we'll deal with that again when we get to fiscal policy. And again, okay, this summarizes everything we've been talking about. This is the blue line, okay? This is the capital to labor ratio. This is an increase in the factors of production, okay? You note it was always positive throughout the entire period we were looking at from 2000 to 2017. It was positive, but it varied. Some years it moved out very far. Some years it moved out very little, okay? So as it's moving outward, at the same time you have positive gross domestic product. That means you're moving closer to your potential. So at the same time that you're moving closer to your potential by increasing gross domestic product, by increasing actual production, so too, you're increasing potential production. This comes from investment. This comes largely, a little bit from investment, but largely this comes from consumption. This is short-term growth. This is long-term growth, okay? And you want to fully get your idea on this, okay? All right. Now we look at the data. And this comes from that, particularly that capital to labor comparison, growth rate comparison to the GDP growth rate, okay? GDP growth from 2009 to 2010 was greater than the capital growth, 2009, 2010, okay? Now what we said was what that means is that your increase in potential production is less than your increase in actual production, which means that what you're doing is you're moving closer to potential production. In the previous slide, you're working within the PPC, you're moving closer to your production possibility curve horizon. PPC outward shift slowed, inward movement from point A to point B increased, more short-run growth, less long-run growth. And what we saw was that between 2001, if you can harken back all the way back to our original discussion from the last slideshow of gross domestic product, what we saw was that the percentage of gross domestic product that was consumption was in 2000 in the neighborhood of 66%, and that expanded to nearly 70%. Okay, that's short-run growth. That means you're moving closer to your potential. When you look at investment and when the figure shifts in favor of investment, that means you're expanding potential production. Okay, when the capital to labor growth rate is less than the GDP growth rate, the economy is moving closer to potential GDP, which I've mentioned before. Now, our conclusion on economic growth. We note from the chart, okay, that from 2013 to 2015, GDP growth rates increased, but growth in the capital labor ratio slowed. The GDP growth was not investment. Okay, so we're dealing with short-term growth, which I mentioned last time. Part of the GDP growth is investment. Part of what people spend on is investment. And if you look through the table from the previous slideshow, you'll see that investment actually does take place. There is increased investment. However, for the most part, that is the replacement of depreciated capital. That's gross investment, not net investment. Okay? So part of the GDP growth is investment. This is reflected in changes in the capital to labor growth rate, and part is consumption. If GDP growth is rising while capital to labor growth is falling, that means GDP growth is a result of consumption, not investment. That means you're dealing with short-term growth, not long-term growth. Okay? And we'll deal with that again. We'll discuss that a little bit more when we get to fiscal policy and what the government is attempting in various fiscal policies, and we'll deal with that still later when we deal with monetary policy, what they're attempting to achieve. Okay, are they trying to achieve long-term growth, or are they trying to achieve short-term growth? Well, it depends on what they're doing with various fiscal and monetary tools, which we'll go over when we get there, in terms of fostering either consumption or investment. Okay.